En route to his golf resort in northern Jersey, the president spoke with reporters on Air Force One. Again, audio but not video was allowed of his comments, and he was asked to comment on filling this Kennedy vacancy on the Supreme Court. He said he'll make his choice public on July 9, and he talked about his list of judicial candidates.
We have great people. You know, we have 25 very outstanding people. Look, I like them all. I think they're
five.
But I've got it down to about 5.
Are you looking for somebody who would overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, you know, it's a great group of intellectual talent, but we really, you know, they are generally conservative. I'm not going to ask them that question, by the way. That's not a question I'll be asking. But it is a group of very highly talented, very brilliant, mostly conservative judges.
The president said there are 2 women among the 5 names on his list, and we want to talk about the list with one of the leading living experts on the Supreme Court. Tom Goldstein, and we're so happy to have him, has been of counsel in over 100 cases before the court. Importantly, he has personally argued 41 cases before the court. How many of you argued? There are only 3 people in the modern era who have argued more. In his spare time, he is the publisher of SCOTUS blog about the court and has taught at Harvard and Stanford Law Schools. Thanks for coming up from D.C.
Thanks for having me.
What allows the president, before we get to the list, what allows the president to say, I'm not going to ask them about Roe? Isn't it the fact that these have all been vetted to within an inch of their lives by the Federalist Society?
Well, the president did something very clever, and that is he turned to conservatives, true rock-ribbed conservatives who were concerned about the courts ahead of time, and said, you give me the candidates to start with. And so these are really well-known commodities going into the process. A lot is known about them, including with respect to how they deal with these constitutional issues before he ever has to talk to them.
And another question before we get into our lightning round of the names. The president's sister is not just a federal judge, a senior federal judge. We never hear about that, and it doesn't seem to be the source of a lot of family conversation. Will she play at all a role in this process?
Well, it was said that she played a role last time. One of the candidates that we'll talk about served with her, and so was known to her, and she might have passed along the recommendation. But it is really interesting that he doesn't seem to be turning in that direction. His family, very important to him for advice, but apparently not in this context specifically. It's these outside groups that are the most important.
All right. So all your brain power and bona fides that I ran through in introducing you to the audience, that goes into your best guess list of what he's holding in his hand, starting with Brett Kavanaugh of Maryland U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit.
Probably our #1 candidate. He was a deputy to Ken Starr. He's on the 2nd most important court of appeals in the country. Very well-known commodity, probably the inside Washington candidate, which is actually quite important when you talk about these different groups. He has been involved in a lot of environmental regulation cases. A question was raised about him originally, and he wasn't on the president's first list because he was presented with the challenge to Obamacare, and he didn't vote to strike it down. He voted for the proposition that the courts can't get involved in all. But since then, his stock has really risen, and I think he's probably, if you ask who's the leading candidate, it's Judge Kavanaugh.
Maggie Haberman of the New York Times tweeted tonight that the president's interested mostly in candidates from Harvard or Yale. He's a Yaley all the way, so that would be interesting.
And he's got one other characteristic, too, and that is he's a former clerk to Justice Kennedy. And I do think we had the sense that there were some back-channel suggestions to Justice Kennedy, and we'll talk about another one of his former clerks, might well replace him to give him a sense of continuity in his legacy was safe.
The next name is highly interesting. Among her biographical details, she's the mother of 7. And she got into quite a well-publicized conversation about being a religious Catholic with Senator Dianne Feinstein. Her name is Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana U.S. Court of Appeals, 7th Circuit.
Yes, she's a former professor at Notre Dame Law School. The one thing about her is that she just doesn't have a ton of legal experience. She's deeply respected, well-known, but you haven't seen her decide a lot of cases.
Only been on the bench a few months.
Exactly. She's a Trump appointee. She's younger than 50, which is actually regarded as a good thing. But it might be the case that she ends up needing a little bit more seasoning before they have enough confidence to say she's the one. But she's a rising star, no question.
A federal judge known to Mitch McConnell, Amul Tapar of Kentucky, U.S. Court of Appeals, 6th Circuit.
Yeah, and that's probably helped him, no doubt, given Senator McConnell's important role in all of this process. Again, someone who doesn't have a lot of Court of Appeals experience. He was a district judge, recently elevated. He was in interviewed the last time around, so he's clearly a serious candidate. The second Asian American, Indian American judge on the U.S. Courts of Appeal, so a significant jurist, but hasn't had a lot to say on a lot of very hot button issues so far. Again, might raise too many questions for having that confidence that he might not drift to the left.
But again, he would, of course, be a first on the court in terms of Southern Asians. Thomas Hardiman of Pennsylvania. This is the man known as the favorite of the president's sister,
yes,
the senior federal judge. Talk about him.
Well, he came in second last time, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not President Trump thinks, hey, that's the guy who I thought was great last time, or he wasn't good enough for me last time. Deeply respected, has been involved in a number of cases involving gun rights, for example, which is a very significant issue and has tended to rule in favor of those rights. A very soft-spoken guy, so he has not been involved in a lot of other ideological disputes, but he does have the advantage that he is certainly known to the president going in.
The next one is Raymond Kethledge of Michigan, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Heard his name a little bit more today.
Yeah, another former Kennedy clerk 20 years ago. So he's been on the U.S. Court of Appeals for a longer time. He has a little bit more seasoning, not quite as long as Judge Kavanaugh, but enough for them to get a real sense of him. And we have several of these judges who are out of Michigan and the Sixth Circuit from the heartland of the country. And the president last time seemed very interested in that. We didn't get a lot of inside the Beltway action.
The woman who could be the second woman on the president's list that he's talking about, Joan Larson of Michigan, Court of Appeals, Sixth Circuit.
Another recent transplant to the Court of Appeals. She came off of the state Supreme Court, so she hasn't been there for very long, but has been regarded, particularly in academic circles for a long time, for quite a while, as someone who's a very, very solid conservative. If the president is interested in somebody who's a little bit, not just 46 years old, but has more judicial experience, he might go for Larson.
Your wild card, William H. Pryor Jr., Alabama, the 11th Circuit, is known for one thing, and that is his resistance to Roe versus Wade.
Off-stated and strongly stated. So if the president decides, I really need for movement conservatives, evangelicals, to get out there and support me, get to the polls, support this nominee, if you want the nuclear option, it's Bill Pryor. Deeply respected intellect, but he is the one person who could throw into question some of the support of the centrist Republican senators who do express some concern about Roe versus Wade. But he would really, really, really create an all-out war and maybe a distraction from other things in politics.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.